Welcome to another Guitar Stuff This Guy Does video. This video is about my Red Hot Chili Pepper Squire decal project. This is the second time I have added a picture decal to the front of a guitar. I used an airbrush to add a buildup of paint to hide the edge of the paper, and then I used a clear coat to seal it all in. The first time I did this was the Pulp Fiction decal project. The main difference between this one and the Pulp Fiction one is that the paper I used on the Pulp Fiction project was a thicker 200 GSM paper with a high gloss, and this one was just plain matte printed paper. The other difference is that I did not use a graphic that required a clear pickguard to increase the real estate or the area needed for the graphic. I also painted the headstock on this one and added the Chili Pepper logo to it with an airbrush using a stencil. I actually really liked how they turned out aesthetically and tonally. I really think someone will get something out of watching this process I used, so I am happy to share it here on the YouTubes for all to see. So without further ado, here we go. I purchased this Squire Stratocaster through Gumtree. The guy who owned it obviously took good care of it, and it plays really well. Upgrading the pickups to a set of Mexican-made Fender pickups I bought through eBay was well worth it. Now it has that classic Stratocaster quack. I was not originally planning on using the silver pickguard until I realised that it fits the colour scheme of the album cover art I was using. The only colours used on the cover art were black, red, white and silver. For the undercoat, I used British Paint's Prep 4-in-1. It mainly seals undercoats and primes, and is the undercoat colour. That's the fourth thing, the colour. At this time, I really hadn't figured out the benefits of either using water-based or oil-based undercoat paints. So since this primer was oil-based, I had to stick with non-water-based paints moving forward. I ended up selecting a product based primarily on two constraints: oil-based and not enamel. I bought an oil-based paint in a tube, the type of paint you would normally apply to a canvas with a brush. I thinned it as best as I could with mineral terps, which is mineral spirits, and then methylated spirits, which is deneutralized alcohol for y'all Americans, to put it through the paint gun. The only major downside to using this paint was that it took about 1 month to fully cure. Now, I'm not saying it was a big mistake, but I would not suggest anyone else do this, and I will never use it again. I expected that as long as I could get the viscosity down enough to shoot this paint through my gun, I had a good chance of success. I just strained it, and whatever paint particles went through the strainer went through the gun. The paint took about 2 to 3 weeks to dry properly. You are not really going to be able to tell from these shots how it would turn out, but this paint turned out to be very matte and felt a bit chalky to the touch when it dried. I would then wet sand it to make sure that it was flat before adding glue and the printout. So what you see in this video is the recording of me gluing down the polyester fabric. I thought I would try this fabric because logically it would last longer than paper under a clear coat. But after 5 years, I don't see any sign of it deteriorating in any way. This attempt to add the polyester print was a failure simply because I added far too much glue. The final version was just the regular printer paper printout that I had made at the same time as the polyester print. Since the process was exactly the same, except for how much glue there was, I am adding this to the video to show you how it was done. From this point on, you will only see the plain paper version and not the polyester fabric one. After the paper was stuck to the body and the glue dried, I cut back the excess paper from the edges with an X-Acto blade. I used it to slice and scrape back the overhanging paper, making the profile of the paper edge as low as possible for the paint that would be added later to hide this transition. The images on the paper were pretty much unprotected except for this sheet of plastic paper I used to cover up the top surface. It was to protect the print from being painted on or damaged. The goal here was to hide the edge of the paper using paint. I used my airbrush to add paint around the edge of the paper, and then I could sand it back to smooth over the transition with paint fused into the edge of the paper. Now, before I go on, I just wanted to address the elephant in the room. In these shots of me painting fresh white paint on old white paint, I have to admit that it's a bit hard to see the paint going on. I have zoomed in where possible to give you the best chance of seeing where the paint is hitting the body. To be honest, when you are watching it, it takes a trained eye sometimes to know when you are seeing the paint hit the body, or if it's a shadow, or a reflection of my hand, or the airbrush. After a while it does become a bit more obvious to see what's going on, but it's white paint on white paint. What the fuck do you want? Adding these layers to the edge with the airbrush provided the next layer something to bond with. I kept repeating this process until the fluffy paper edges were smooth and the transition was no longer obvious. This was the magic trick I had to perform to make this project a success and hide any signs that this was paper glued to the body. I used dry sandpaper glued to small rectangles of rubber to smooth the painted edges when the paint had dried. I didn't do wet sanding because I didn't want to wet the paper. I was actually using an oil-based enamel paint through this airbrush, which was thinned with enamel thinner. The second time around, I was laying the paint down quite thick just to flood that edge and give me something meaty to sand back. This decision was based on what I had learnt while sanding smooth the previous round of painting. By now I knew that it really did not matter how thick and rough it got laid down. Even runs really wouldn't matter. When it was dry again, I could just hit it with sandpaper. It would help me conform to the natural curve of the edge of the guitar body. The more dried paint I had to work with, the better, and the more it would cover the edge of the paper. According to some YouTube experts, paint is not a filler. However, in this video you will see how I've been able to use an oil-based paint enamel to build up enough paint matter to effectively use it as a filler. Either I'm very special, or they didn't mean all types of paint. Either way, fuck that guy. I proved him wrong enough to get done what I wanted to. Now, before anyone comments that adding a layer of paper to the front of a guitar would negatively affect the resonance of the guitar body, and that you would disagree with using this method, just don't. I've set up a special email address for you to write to and express all your Tonewood opinions. It's thisguy.doesn't-give-a-damn@yourface.com. I do apologise if that came across rather aggressive, but I was just trying to get my point across. Thank you. Apologies for anyone who has been triggered. Anyone triggered can use the email address that I mentioned just before. So as you can see, there was a little bit of an issue with the area where Chad is. Here's the second band member from the right above the pickup cavity near the belly cut. I pretty much decided to swap his section out using the spare printout. I think there was a rip or a crease which wasn't flat or removed some of the print. The layers of white paint added later flooded the seams, so there was no bumps, but you can still see the cut lines on the paper in the finished job. My feelings on this is that a lot of the original printed content has been slightly affected one way or another throughout the painting process. Part of the tongue graphics have been covered, and the faded edges around the chili pepper logo have been covered. But in the end, it all just adds character to the whole thing. It gives it a roughed up and aged look to the graphic, all sealed up in a perfect glass-like clear coat. This is the phase where I am spraying the polyurethane clear coat just onto the printed images. I needed to add some more white paint where there was no printed images and cover the unpainted areas of the paper surface. The other motivation to do this was to try to cover the seams where Chad was replaced, because the cutting line seams were more obvious than I thought they would be. I had to cover the printed areas with clear coat first, before I went anywhere near the front of this decal with the white paint. First I made a reverse mask for blocking out where the white paint would go later. The clear coat and the white enamel paint were both oil based, so I would not have adhesion issues, but I just didn't want to add the white paint over the top of the clear coat. I just cut the masking stencil so that the polyurethane clear coat would only cover the printed images. Once I had sprayed enough clear coat protecting the images, I stopped. You can see already how much this polyurethane has a bit of a tint to it. It's actually a shade of purple in the tin. I don't know why it's purple, but when it's applied it adds this slightly brown tint. For this white paint, each layer added a few shades of a yellowish tint. It just really gave it an aged off-white look, which I was surprised at first. Now I really love it, and I would almost do this again to give a new paint job an aged look without relicking it. So here you can see how much darker the clear coat has coloured the printed areas that I wanted to protect. You can see where the sticky tape was that held this template down, and the contrast between the unaffected white paint and the tint from just a few layers of the clear coat. This whole area will be flooded with another coat of white, so I wasn't too concerned about this area. This was the last spare copy of the printout that I had. I believed I ordered a material copy which was scrapped, and 3 copies of the printout on normal A3 regular matte printer paper. Because of the size, I could not print it at home on A4. To keep the paper masks from flopping around from the paint gun's air pressure, I stuck the image to some very stiff cardboard to give it plenty of support. I also glued some toothpicks on the underside which elevated these pieces away from the guitar face. This would allow a small amount of overspray, but it would avoid a capillary action that could suck the paint under the cardboard if it were only on the face of the printed area, but not making perfect contact. The word for today, kids, is capillary. These toothpicks and blue tack held the mask to the body, but away enough so that the coats of white paint would meet up with the edge of the clear coat that was laid with the reverse mask. In the end, this is just a method of controlling sprayed paint that I designed. I haven't seen anyone do this, and you can see that I developed this technique when I was trying to control the sunburst with the raised template method on my first ever project. I think I mentioned it earlier, but this is white enamel paint, which is oil-based and has been thinned with enamel thinner. Once this project had an oil-based primer on it, it was locked in and I could not use any water-based paints as there would be adhesion issues. That's just how paint works apparently. The artist's type of oil-based paint out of a tube, which I sprayed onto the guitar before the images went on, cemented the use of oil-based paints moving forward. I had already told myself to never use enamel paints again after my experience with enamel spray can paints on the spray can Sunburst Squire Strat. However, I figured that by using a paint gun it would keep the layers thin, it would dry quite tough, and I wouldn't have the same problems that I did with the Sunburst Squire project. I think this paint was better quality than what I had used from the spray cans on the Sunburst project, because even though I'd laid it a little thick in some areas, it set quite firm and glossy, but did not become rubbery due to the thickness. So I would have been trying to get this paint as thick as I can to make it even with the thickness of the clear coat that I had put onto the printed areas below. I would have done about 2 or 3 coats and then come back 15 minutes later to give it another 3 coats and then repeat this process. At this point, the area under the mask already has clear coat on it. I was pretty much aiming the gun up into the gap between the masked edge and the printed area. So though they were already covered with clear coat, I was making sure that the edges overlapped. I didn't want there to be gaps between the white paint and the clear coat where the images were. It wouldn't have been a major problem. Having gaps would have simply required me to add more clear coat in the final stages. So it was no biggie. At the beginning of every spraying session, I wipe down the surface of the body with a cleaning agent, or a gleaning agent as per my fucking typo. I started with Windex window cleaner, then I started buying isopropyl alcohol in a spray bottle, which I don't really think is the right stuff anyway, but it cleaned well enough. I would then use lint-free paper towels to wipe them down. Then I would let it sit for at least 2 minutes to dry off, and then maybe spray it all over with an air blower attachment from my compressor, or just the paint gun, you know, with the trigger only pulled far enough to let the air through without releasing any paint. Recently I bought a specific wax and grease remover product from the auto shop. I will use that in future. This is where you will see how the clear coat that I used is tinted purple, at least when it comes out of the tin. This is just an oil-based polyurethane that comes from the hardware shop in a tin. It's mainly a product for coating projects made of wood. I haven't looked into using car-grade clear coats or 2-pack paint products. Most people wouldn't notice this tint happening when they use it on natural or stained wood. I never expected it to make a noticeable difference, and I really only realised the impact after spraying over this white paint for the first time. After the second coat, it was really starting to turn a very off-white or a bone colour. It was uneven shades across the different areas depending on how thick I laid the clear in different areas, combined with how I would have wet sanded some areas more than others, leaving thicknesses uneven. So all over the body there are slightly different transitions of lighter off-white to creamy vanilla or a bone colour. I quite like the way it turned out in the end. Looking at that spray, I really did not have the gun set right, but that's to my standards that I hold to myself today. I will admit that there is one benefit of so much overspray like this, because the more atomization that occurs, the layers would be thinner. This actually reduces the chance of causing runs a fair bit. So in short, it would release the paint in a more controlled way. This might have actually been beneficial to a beginner like myself at the time. This was back when I still became very nervous and anxious when it came to spraying the paint gun. When I watch these videos back, I also see many things I'm doing wrong. It has helped me learn from what I see and reinforces aspects that I will approach differently in future. But again, this is probably just all coming from being more experienced. I will spend a little more time setting up the paint gun a bit better these days. I have more of an idea about how I want the product to spray out and what I want to achieve. The first change I will be making is to lower the pressure as low as I can, then raise it until the paint is flowing out without excess overspray. Lowering the pressure was something that I was afraid to do because early on I believed that you had to set the pressure flow to the gun for at least 25 psi, and I would just keep holding myself to this. Experience has taught me otherwise. I would have picked up this from YouTube, however they might have been using different types of guns that are not HVLP, or they were, but I interpreted their instructions incorrectly. By this point in my journey, to avoid runs, my method was just to make 3 passes all over, and then wait 2 to 3 minutes, and then add 3 more coats, and repeat. This sounds excessive to me now, but with so much of the product going into the air as overspray, and with that causing these layers to be so thin, it was an okay situation. If I were to set the paint gun to have lower pressure and more product hitting the project, I would have had to hold back more, keeping the gun moving and maybe only do 2 passes and then wait 10 minutes before going again. This is what I have already had success with on my later projects like the Axe Base and the SG Firebird project. I have almost eliminated my chances of causing runs in the paint. Of all the various paint and clear coat sessions on the Axe Base, maybe 7, I maybe only had 1 run, maybe 2. And with the SG Firebird project with maybe 5 sessions, I can't recall any noteworthy runs happening. This was nothing like what I had experienced on my first 3 projects using the paint gun. So it took a lot of patience to hit it, go away for a few minutes, come back for 3 more coats, wait a couple minutes, hit it again, etc. I've learned that you should repeat this until that you are happy that there are sufficient coats, but that it's not so thick that the first coats won't dry and moisture is not being trapped. Also, if you just keep going on the same day, you are bound to get a thickness of wet paint that there will be runs or sagging. This would be a good time to mention the wooden arms that I made to hold the guitar in the stand that I put together using a speaker stand. I just rounded the end of the wood so it fit into the cardboard tubes on each side of the stand. The handle helps me rotate it without touching any of the wet paint on the guitar body. I have to wear a glove on that hand because the handle usually gets paint on it in the process. I intentionally avoided aligning the screws with where the neck screws go, and I added these plastic washers on the inside of the stick to raise the stick away from the back of the neck so the paint would not form a link to the stick. I had to super glue these things in. At this point you can see how bone coloured the body has become. When the clear coat went on, it was quite clear and the white paint still looked white. It changed colour as the clear coat cured. This would have been quite a short wet sanding session as there was very little orange peel or unevenness to the finish. On this guitar it was still required, however on this round of clear coat there was very little orange peel to deal with. Wet sanding a Strat body would normally take me 2 to 4 hours depending on how many grits of sandpaper that I had to go through. Looking at all that overspray, I am again reminded that this was the first paint job where I did not overdo it and cause any runs. From memory, I still believe that this paint job had no runs, or at least in the clear coat phases. On most of the paint jobs before this one, there was usually a run here or there that I had to sand back and deal with when the clear coat had dried. I remember a very bad run on the Pulp Fiction video. I even made a point of it in the video for that project. There was one on the back of the Good Maten body that took 3 clear coat sessions before it was dealt with. But considering the amount of overspray on this one, and how cautious I would have become, I would call this the first project where I was able to avoid runs in the clear coat during all sessions. You can see the orange peel effect there when you look at the shiny bits in the light. It would look a bit different when it dries, but that's pretty much what it looks like when it is dried. I would just have to wet sand just until those pits all became flats, and then polish it with a buffing pad. I kept this hung up for at least a month before I sanded and polished it. I really wanted that polyurethane to be as hard as it was going to get before I sanded it. Obviously, I must not have recorded the last wet sanding. I'm just moving on here to the buffing and polishing. I've found that once I have wet sanded to 400 grit sandpaper and everything is flat, I could move on to buffing. I don't know why, but it just works. I use Meguiar's polishing compound, and you will see the bottle there. The only annoying thing about buffing the guitar is trying to do the edges, but I do have the right buffing tools to put on the end of a drill. It works for me, and it is actually cheaper than buying an actual buffing machine. Many of my guitars have come up so shiny that I've never felt the need to buy an actual buffing machine. Every guitar I've done with this method and tool has come up 100%. In the cutaway you can see the reflection of the light or the wall or something. It's very nice and shiny. You may have noticed this rectangular fence around the area where I am buffing. Well, if you didn't, I'm bringing it to your attention now. It is there to catch the splatter of liquid compound that flies off the buffing pad in all directions. If you don't have one of these, the room will become contaminated with random droplets that could get quite messy. The splatter that you see on the inside of the fence is the build-up of 5 different buffing sessions prior. This attachment is my secret weapon for getting into the most awkward parts of the horns and the sides of the body. I just use this drill bit mounted buffing cylinder. I always add masking tape or painter's tape around the chuck. This is to protect the body and the fresh paint job from that nasty, jagged, spinning metal chuck. Imagine what damage that type of chuck could do if it were to dance around the edge of your guitar. It would absolutely tear through the paint, it would tear through the polish, and it would tear through the polyurethane and put a nasty chunk into the edge of your guitar. So while it's a smart idea to use these buffing attachments, it's even much smarter to protect the shit out of your guitar from this drill chuck if you were to lose control. I feel 100% confident that this would prevent the chuck from hitting my guitar body. I get these buffing attachments from my local auto shop. They are just drill attachment bits that have cotton cloth bunched up at one end. They are held with a screw and washer to the end of a chuck drill bit. They are quite cheap, and I usually just buy one new one each time I start a project. One of these Meguiar's bottles usually lasts for about 5 guitar bodies. I am always impressed at how shiny and glass-like the finish turns out at the end of the buffing session. It's not bad for just a paper printout job stuck to a guitar with glue. Many would say this would dampen or some way affect the tone of this guitar. Being at the low end of guitar production and craftsmanship, I don't think a thin layer of paper is going to make a noticeable difference to the tone, especially when the overdrive is on. There will be another video where I convert the original HSS pickguard into an SSS capable pickguard. I could have just stayed with the stock Squier made pickups, but I'm very glad that I installed the second-hand Mexican Strat pickups. I really hope that you like seeing this project. Check out the next 2 videos, which should be released sometime soon, in which there will be a pickguard conversion and the paint job on the headstock, where I use stencils and an airbrush to add the Chili Pepper star logo to the headstock of this guitar. I hope you are all well. I hope you all stay safe. I will see you in the next one, and until next time, have a bloody good one.